Good evening, everyone. I'm Doug Cushman, and I'm the president of the Case Management Society of New England, and I'd like to welcome you to our program this evening, Question, Persuade, and Refer for Suicide Prevention. Our session this evening is sponsored in part by Bain Care. We're very appreciative that you've chosen to join us this evening. Your commitment to CMSNE is truly appreciated. CMSNE is the oldest and largest chapter of CMSA. We have over 400 members and 8 corporate partners. We're entering our 32nd year in existence, and we continue to strive to fulfill our mission to provide a platform for professional development and interaction. Your continued support will help us do that. We currently have one open board position, that is the Massachusetts Extension Co-Chair. We also have many opportunities to serve on committees. We'd like to help you expand your involvement with CMSNE and offer many opportunities at all levels of participation. If you'd like to discuss and explore what is available, please don't hesitate to contact me or Maureen Ferguson or any of the other board members to start a discussion. I want to tell you about an upcoming program we have in December. December 3rd, we'll be presenting long-term care, short-term rehab in the COVID pandemic. This will be presented by and sponsored by Duville Life and Wellness Community. That is December 3rd at 6 p.m. If you're interested in registering for this program, registration is open on our website, www.cmsne.org. Right now, I'd like to introduce Nancy Zappolo, who is the coordinator of this program, as well as the Vice President for Care Integration at Bain Care, who is our sponsor for this evening's program. I'd like to thank Bain Care for their generous sponsorship and thank Nancy for working so hard on coordinating this program for CMSNE. Nancy's going to take a couple of minutes to tell you about Bain Care, then she'll go over some housekeeping items, and then she'll introduce our speaker for this evening. Thank you all for joining us. Go ahead, Nancy.
Thank you, Doug. Welcome, everyone. I'll tell you a little bit about Bain Care. We have 11 skilled nursing centers in Eastern and Western Mass and 2 assisted living facilities. We have been family operated since inception in 1959, and our nursing centers offer both long-term care as well as subacute short-stay programs for conditions needing rehab therapy, IV therapy, nursing care, disease management, such as our congestive heart failure program, and also discharge teaching. Bain Care prides itself on our rich history of family values, delivering patient-centered care, along with the complex medical capabilities and advancing technologies required this day and age. COVID-19 has certainly put our industry to the test this year, but as often is the case with unprecedented challenges, we are coming out stronger than ever. We have infection preventionists, we have infection control procedures like I've never seen, and I doubt at this point you'll find a cleaner place than a nursing center. We look forward, though, to when our activities programs and our visitation programs can be liberalized again to meet our residents' needs. But I'm very proud of all the work, not only Bain Care, but all of our skilled nursing facility neighbors have put into making our places safe. I'd like to welcome you to the Case Management Society of New England online educational webinar, Question, Persuade, and Refer, QPR, for suicide prevention. This program has been approved for 2 RN social work and CCM hours. And here are a few housekeeping details to go over. First and foremost, as participants, you are not seen by anyone during this presentation. The only individuals seen are the host and the panelist/speaker. All participants have been muted for this session. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. All questions are anonymous, and we prefer you use the Q&A box rather than the chat box. We have set time at the end of the session to answer as many questions as we can, but also we'll be watching for questions throughout the webinar that we will try to answer as we go. Upon leaving the webinar, you will receive a message from Zoom. Select the blue continue box, and this will take you to the link for the session evaluation. Please complete that evaluation, but don't worry if you don't receive the message, as one will be sent to you within 24 hours with evaluation and handout links. You will receive your certification of attendance from CMSNE 2 to 3 days after you complete your eval, sent to the email address you registered from. Please check your spam or junk mail, as our emails are sometimes directed there. If you do not have a certificate by then, please do contact the office directly. Please be sure to share topics of interest or potential speakers for future planning in the evaluation tool. And finally, since webinars are still new to us, we ask for a little grace from you as attendees as we make our way through this new technology. I'm now pleased to introduce Paul Williams, our speaker for this evening. Paul is the Substance Use Coordinator for the town of Weymouth. He works with both the Health Department and the Mayor's Office on behavioral health issues and programs for the benefit of the community. Previously, he was the Manager of Strategic Outreach at the Lown Institute and has worked for Healthcare for All as a policy coordinator. Prior to joining Healthcare for All, he was the coordinator of the Boston Hope and Recovery Coalition, a community-based coalition focused on opioid overdose prevention and suicide prevention. Welcome to Paul.
Thank you very much, Nancy. I appreciate it, and thank you everybody for taking time tonight to participate in this training. It's one that I've done for a long time, about 10 years now, and I really enjoy doing this training. I enjoy talking to folks. This is the first time, I will be candid with the audience, it's the first time I've done the training via Zoom, but we live in interesting times, so I hope I can keep this interesting. I hope I can engage your questions. Speaking of which, as Nancy mentioned, if you use the Q&A button, feel free throughout the entire training to ask questions as it pertains to the slide. You don't have to wait till the end, just use the Q&A, and Nancy will interrupt me and we will go from there. So I'm going to dive into this and we will give our best shot. If I'm speaking too fast, feel free to tell me to slow down. I will say that if at any point you are uncomfortable, you can tell this was a pre-pandemic slide. Feel free to quietly just exit. Your guys are on mute, so you'll be quietly exiting. But we do get into topics of suicide and suicide prevention. Sometimes it can be triggering for individuals, so feel free to just take a step away if you need it. So who am I? I'm the QPR trainer. I've been doing this training for over 10 years. As Nancy mentioned, I do substance abuse prevention work currently, behavioral health, mental health issues. That includes a lot of policy, a lot of programming, everything from the opioid lawsuit that the town has brought forth to and offering recommendations with our town solicitor to actually doing live referrals. I still will have individuals come in, and it reminds me of my old case management days. So it's a little of everything. And currently in COVID world, I am doing a lot of contact tracing and assisting our public health nurses in talking to people about uncomfortable topics when they pop positive for COVID and what that means. So I've actually been working on social service type issues since the mid-90s. I got my start in a soup kitchen actually in Philadelphia, which is, it's interesting to hear Philadelphia over and over again currently in the news because it's a beloved city of mine. And that's where I got my start, and I got to see sort of mental health issues and substance use firsthand when I was at that soup kitchen. It really colored the way I look at things in the sense of how this training, how it pertains to this training, is seeing it firsthand and seeing how hopeless people can feel in moments, and then being able to have conversations that offer them a level of hope. That's the thing that attracted me to this training and why I became a trainer with it. It's basically a format and a framework on how you could deliver hope to somebody so that they can get those services and they can start to heal whatever it is that is hurting them. So I'm very open to having further conversations about any of the work that I've done and any of the work around suicide and suicide prevention. So I've provided 2 emails, paulewilliams@gmail.com or pwilliams@weymouth.ma.us. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions or just a random question that pops into your head after this training is done. So let me see. Oh, no, going back. All right, so this is believed to be one of the first suicide notes around. In ancient Egypt, they found a bunch of hieroglyphics that talked about the abject sadness that this gentleman was experiencing. So the reason I put that here is, and we start with that, is people get a little timid around topics like suicide, like overdose, all of the death and dying in general. I know there's a lot of nurses on this call, and I know, and social workers, so we're a little more comfortable in this world, but people get twitchy about it. I put this slide up as a reminder, as that this is suicide and the conditions of human suffering have been around for as long as there's been humans. So this slide is pre-pandemic. So until recently, suicide was the 10th leading cause of death in the US. Each year, about 45,000 Americans die by suicide. For every suicide that's completed, and keep in mind, you're going to hear me say completed, not, some people will say committed or was successful at. I'm a big fan from my substance use world that words matter. So when we talk about suicide, it's a completed suicide. Every suicide, for every one suicide that's completed, there's about 25 attempts that happen that oftentimes aren't reported. And in terms of cost, in terms of the healthcare system, suicide and workforce development, suicide costs the US about $69 billion annually. So this is something you could even make an economic case that you're helping a community with if you're preventing suicide. So unfortunately, like a lot of different epidemics and pandemics, and we've been between opioids and the current pandemic, we're using that phrase a lot. From 1999 to 2016, across the US, it's risen. I'm here in Massachusetts, and what you'll see give me a moment, I'm just going to move we've had about, over that 17-year span, we've had about a 37% increase. I know there's folks in New Hampshire, and that looks to be about a 58% increase over 17. So this is cause for concern. This is still a public health issue. This is still something that we need to be vigilant about. And as we move forward in this world that we live in, the fact that I'm giving a training from my sunroom into my computer, and we talk a lot about social isolation, we still don't have the data to show us what exactly is happening, but we know that it's not good for the human condition to be isolated like we have been since late February, early March. Couple more facts and figures, and we're going to move right into the training. So on average, and this again to our northern neighbors, I apologize. I typically give this presentation in Massachusetts, so it's going to be Massachusetts heavy. So in Massachusetts, on average, about one person dies by suicide every 14 hours. There's more than 4 times as many people die by suicide in Massachusetts annually than by homicide. So the question for that one would be, some people would ask why. And a lot of that, it has to do with the fact that we have very strict gun control laws here. So the means in which you can commit or complete suicide and the means in which you can commit homicide, guns play a bigger role in homicide. So that's sort of, again, these policy recommendations that people can do to sort of move the needle on public health issues. And then we thankfully are one of the last states in terms of our rank, but it still is the leading cause in Massachusetts. It's the 13th leading cause in Massachusetts for death. But I want to really sort of bring your attention to one specific cause of death. It's the second leading cause of death for ages 15 to 34. And that is of grave concern because that's our next generation. So before I move to the next bit, I was wondering, Nancy, if there's any questions or if anybody, I want to give a moment about the sort of facts and figures.
No, there were no questions in the Q&A, but back to our introduction, somebody asked about your educational background in this area.
Oh, okay. So there's two things: social worker by training, and then with this particular training, it's a train the trainer model that is sort of the longer version of what you're receiving. And I'll explain sort of about QPR in just a second, but I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thanks.
Okay. All right, now. There we are. So what is QPR? It's not intended to be a form of counseling or treatment. It is intended to offer hope through positive action. So QPR was really developed by Dr. Paul Quinnett out in on the West Coast as a response to the rising issues around suicide, rising numbers. And what Dr. Quinnett looked at is he said he wanted a training that was similar to CPR, where it was you could easily remember it, you could access it quickly in a time of crisis, and people would be comfortable doing it. So sort of universalizing it the way CPR is universalized to help folks who are having issues. So, but it isn't, and I stress this, and with this group, I don't necessarily have to stress it because all of us have professional background in this. It's not a form of counseling and treatment. This is a training that's focused on basically triaging the individual so you can get them to a higher level of care. Yep. All right, so we'll walk through some of the myths and facts. So no one can stop a suicide. It's inevitable. It's an absolute myth. If people are in crisis, get the help they need. They will and some of these I will offer some editorial content on. The QPR Institute says you have to use these slides and you can't alter the language. You can add to it like I did in the beginning section. But I will, in my professional experience, give a little bit of a commentary. So the fact, no one can stop suicide. Fact is, if a person is in a crisis and they get the help they need, they probably will never be suicidal again. I would take away the never part of it. I think all of us who have worked with clients before know that there are individuals that it does happen again, and the cycle can continue. So never seems to be a little bit of a strong term in my opinion. So myth: confronting a person about suicide will only make them angry and increase the risk of suicide. This actually is an absolute myth. The fact of the matter is, if someone is asked directly about suicidal intent, it lowers anxiety and it opens communication. and it lowers the impulsive act. So I worked with this gentleman who did, a doctor who was specialized in trauma. Some folks may know him on this call, but it was Dr. Robert Macy, who is just a brilliant man in the world of suicidality. But he always used to say it's a permanent act to deal with a temporary feeling or situation. And that's where we want to lower, in talking to the individual, we want to lower the risk of that impulsive act. So only experts can prevent, another myth, only experts can prevent suicide. This is a gatekeeper training. This training has been done with folks like you who are professionals in the world of healthcare, but it's also been, I've done this training with hairdressers. And I've done this training with church youth groups. So suicide prevention is everybody's business and anyone can help. And that's why we started from the top saying this isn't counseling or this isn't treatment, because the last thing you want is a youth group member thinking they're providing some sort of clinical intervention. It's not. It's a framework on how to talk to someone if they're in crisis or they're in that mode of wanting to complete a suicide. Suicidal people keep their plans to themselves. Absolute myth. Most folks will communicate their intent sometime during the week or weeks preceding their attempt. And we'll get into some of those warning signs and those sort of, oh, maybe I should pay attention or have the conversation with them. Myth, those who talk about suicide don't do it. No, any of us who have worked with patients or clients in any kind of capacity, if people are talking about it, they're thinking about it. So continue the conversation. Once a myth is once a person decides to complete suicide, there's nothing anyone can do to stop it. That is an absolute myth. It is, and here's the editorial. The slide says it's the most preventable kind of death. It is a very preventable kind of death. So we will continue. So those myths and facts that people sometimes have about suicide. So what are some of the clues and the warning signs? And really, the more clues and signs you observe, the greater the risk. Take all the signs seriously. So direct verbal cues. I've decided to kill myself. I wish I was dead. I'm going to commit suicide. I'm going to end it all. And this last one you often hear and see. This is one of those sort of red flags. If this and this doesn't happen, then I'll kill myself. So it gets into almost the bargaining or the holding somebody up emotionally. Well, if you don't do this, then I'll kill myself. Indirect verbal cues. I'm tired of life. I just can't go on. My family would be better without me. Who cares if I'm dead anyway? I just want out. I won't be around much longer. Pretty soon you won't have to worry about me. So before the call, some of us were talking about addiction in the elderly. And currently there's a lot of unrest and a lot of emotional sort of issues going around with our elderly that are at highest risk and isolated. And you often hear this last indirect verbal clue from the elderly. You won't have to worry about me, or my family would be better off without me. It's the idea that folks sometimes as they age really don't want to be a quote unquote burden on their families. And it's an incredibly sad statement, but it is very much one to pay attention to if you have older individuals who may be at risk. So we'll move on. Are there any questions about that? Put them in the Q&A box. To behavioral clues. Any previous suicide attempts. So this is you'll hear me sort of talk about like interesting facts about it. And I don't mean to minimize the tragedy of suicide or overdose when I say this. It's just professionally, when you stare at it, certain things show up. So any previous suicide attempt, it runs very concurrently actually with opioid overdoses, where if you've overdosed before, you're more likely, for a multitude of reasons, to overdose again. Well, they found that same sort of data point in suicide, that if you've attempted a suicide, there is a stronger probability that you will attempt suicide again, which runs counter to one of the myths and facts at the beginning of the slideshow. But what they found is if the person has attempted and it wasn't addressed at all, there is a higher likelihood that there would be another attempt. Acquiring a gun or stockpiling pills. Stockpiling pills we see a lot, particularly with our aging community. Co-occurring depression, moodiness, or hopelessness. When you see somebody putting their personal affairs in order, that one is one of those definite sort of red flags, and something to pay attention to. And I'll give you sort of a personal example. My grandmother was an artist, actually went to Museum of Fine Arts school much later in life and had a lot of young friends. And so I moved down to Philadelphia, and one of her friends from art school was only a couple years older than I was. And he came to me and he said, I'd like you to pick out some of my artwork, and I'm just cleaning everything out and I'm getting rid of it. I told my grandmother that, and she goes, oh, I have to call him immediately. And I said, what's up, Granny? And she goes, oh, he's done that before, and it's always before he attempts suicide. And it was in that moment, it sort of clicked with me, where it was like, oh, that makes sense. And that sort of bleeds into the next point of giving away prized possessions. And sadly, you do see this with kids, that if they give you away, give you their favorite stuffy or something that means a lot to them, they're wanting to make sure it's safe when they're not there. So that's something that's a real big red flag. A sudden interest or disinterest in religion. This is for a couple reasons. The sudden interest is a lot of people are wondering where are they going to go? Or is my spiritual practice going to send me someplace where I don't want to go if I complete a suicide? A lot of our sort of modern religions do have taboos around completing a suicide. So you find people really super into it and finding out, okay, well, what's going to happen to me? And the same with the disinterest in religion. You can have somebody who is religious and then, suddenly stop going to church and not want to be involved in their religious or spiritual practice at all. And it's almost well, if they don't know I'm doing this, then nothing will happen to me. So it really becomes, again, another sign. Drug or alcohol abuse or relapse after period of recovery. As somebody who works in overdose prevention, I got to point out that the relapse after a period of recovery is the 2 weeks after coming out of a treatment facility or jail or something, that is a very, very delicate time for someone's recovery. And so any support we can provide people in that 2-week period, it's a lot of the majority of fatal overdoses actually occur in that 2-week window, and a lot of folks really start contemplating suicide in that, because they have to figure out their life without the drug or the alcohol that they've been using. And then lastly, and this one I want to flag for everyone, and anyone who works in pediatrics or with children will know why I'm flagging this. This is a behavioral clue that's really good to use. It's very telling with children. And that would be unexplained anger, aggression, or irritability. And the reason this is one of those behavioral clues to pay attention to is that oftentimes in young children, anger, aggression, irritability are symptoms of depression. And I know this is probably old hat for this group, but for lay people, we often think of depression as lethargic, sad, not getting out of bed, those kind of things. But with kids, it's that unexplained anger, aggression, and irritability that is a hallmark of depression in a lot of children. Situational clues. So being fired or expelled from school, a recent unwanted move, a loss of any relationship. The situational clues, I'm not going to get into sort of the why, because I think a lot of the why is evident. Some of them I will. So the death of a spouse, a child, or best friend, especially by suicide. So there's a phenomenon that happens, and we saw it in South Boston. In Massachusetts, we've seen it in South Boston, Nantucket, and there's another community, and I don't want to mistakenly say the community. So there was a third community within the last like 30 years that if somebody has completed a suicide, a cluster effect happens where there's more suicides around that individual. So if somebody dies by suicide in your community, making sure that the people closest to that individual are supported is a terrific preventative tactic to make sure that we're not even getting to the point where we need these conversations that we'll talk about later. So just to sort of flag that for you, if your community has suffered a loss from suicide, then making sure that those who interact with that individual or had some really close relationships with them, making sure they have the supports they need and know how to access the resources, that is a terrific preventative activity. So sudden unexpected loss of freedom or fear of punishment, an anticipated loss of financial security, a loss of a cherished therapist, counselor, or teacher. And then this last one, again, we sort of spoke to it earlier, was the fear of becoming a burden to others. And then this is real. And anybody who works in assisted livings or nursing homes, my wife is a gerontologist by training. And the reality of feeling like you're going to become a burden on someone is a grave concern to a lot of older folks. So before we get into tips, that was a lot of clues. Are there any questions for the Q&A about clues or any thoughts you have about that?
No questions in the Q&A, Paul.
So I'm either doing terrific or you guys are just letting me out here to dry. So I'm going to keep going.
You're doing terrific.
Well, I said to the folks before this training, I was going to get my 18-month-old to sit like next to me, so at least I had like somebody who was making a face at me. Oh, I think so. There might be a Q&A.
Yeah, they said you're doing great.
Oh, okay, thank you. I guess fishing for compliments is the way to do Zoom calls. So, all right, let's dive back into it. Tips for asking the suicide question. If you're in doubt, don't wait. Ask the question. And so this is a lot of times we second guess ourselves. If you think you should be asking a question about suicide, ask the question. And we're going to get into each Q, P, and R and the question. Q is question. So we're going to get into what the question is. If the person is reluctant, be persistent. And I always caveat this again, especially when I'm working with like teenagers, be professionally persistent, because none of us like to be hounded. So yes, be persistent, but also acknowledge that they might need some space to breathe too. Talk to a person alone in a private setting. Again, I feel like this one is not necessarily those of us who are live and breathe HIPAA all the time. I think we all know that the lobby of like South Shore Health isn't the place to be like, are you thinking about killing yourself? Not the spot for it. Allow the person to talk freely. So this is something I've had to work on for years. And the talking free, so you get very, very, in these circumstances, if you think somebody's going to complete a suicide or attempt, you're getting very excited about it, like in a sense, and you're going into the mode. All right, man, I've got my Q and I got my P, and you're going through it. Well, do you think? And shut up for 10 seconds and let them talk. It was, like I said, it is even something I struggle with. at times where it's just like, you need to have them have the space that they feel free to disclose what is a pretty sensitive topic. Give yourself plenty of time. This is, again, these aren't the conversations. If you have to run out at the end of a shift, if you know that you have to get someplace, luckily right now, getting to places is limited. So we have a little more time on our hands, but make sure that you have time to have a full conversation and know it could get raw. I'll add on to that, and one more that they don't talk about, a bullet point, but that's if I'm talking about suicide and I have my phone up and I'm looking at, I'm not 100% engaged with the individual. Again, this is a sort of a bullet point I give to individuals who may be in the lay community, like the hairdressers and the youth group that I talked about earlier. But make sure the phone's on silent, and make sure that you're not looking at it or you're not needed on the phone, because you want to, again, give this time and space to the individual so that they can open up and share with you. Have your resources handy. There is a QPR card. I actually don't think I sent that to Nancy, so I would be more than happy to send a PDF of that so that you have it. It's a foldable card you can keep in your wallet. Phone numbers that you may have, any of your resources, have them available so you're not going, well, hold on, I'll be right back, and then go getting your resources and digging through. Remember, how you ask the question is less important than if you ask it. We've all had those moments where we've stumbled to get the words out properly. There's no proper way to say this in the sense of say it, ask the question, and then go. You're not doing, none of you will do this wrong, I guarantee it. So what's the question? There's a couple approaches. Less direct approach. And this one, and again, I will editorialize. Pick the way that is the most comfortable for you and the easiest way for you. So the less direct approach, I'm not the biggest fan of, because I'm more of a rip the Band-Aid off type of person. But have you been unhappy lately? Have you been very unhappy lately? Have you been so very unhappy lately that you've been thinking about ending your life? So kind of using a build-up to, are you thinking about ending your life? That inevitably, that's the key. That's the thing you want to ask them. This one that folks say works, I'm not 100% sold on it. Do you ever wish you could go to sleep and never wake up? In the case of young children, that would be an approach I probably would end up taking. But again, not 100%. And I feel like if you were to ask that to anybody over the age of 10 or 12, it may infantilize them a little bit. Direct approach. So you know when people are upset, as you seem to be, they sometimes wish they were dead. I'm wondering if you're feeling that way too. That would be probably the approach I would take, that one or the last one. The second one, again, editorializing. I don't think I would ever use this one. You look pretty miserable. I'm wondering if you're thinking about suicide. That's not a great lead in. Like you look pretty miserable. I'm wondering if you're thinking about suicide. In the event that you have a very close friendship relationship with someone, maybe that might be approach, but I know that sentence would personally turn me off. Are you thinking about killing yourself? That's the one I would ask. It is the clearest and to the point. And if you find yourself in a situation where someone is expressing suicidality and you can't ask the question, find someone who can. How not to ask a suicide question. You're not thinking of killing yourself, are you? Because everyone under the sun answers no to that question. You're not, because you've given them permission to say no. And a little bit, these questions shame the individual. Like, that's foolish. You don't think you're not thinking about killing yourself, are you? The next one is very similar. You wouldn't do anything stupid, would you? The last one, suicide is a dumb idea. Surely you're not thinking about suicide. So I say these, and in the clarity of a PowerPoint presentation, everyone looks at that and goes, oh no, of course I wouldn't ask that question. However, if you are a New Englander and you are nervous, there's a strong chance that you will ask this question like this. So just as a reminder, that these aren't the best way, because they will shut the individual down. They will sort of put up blocks where you don't need blocks. Are there any questions about the question part?
Nothing in the Q&A, Paul.
All right. Well, we can go back to it if people are typing right now.
Yep.
All right. So we've asked the question, are you thinking about killing yourself? Now we get to the part where it's persuade. How to persuade someone to stay alive. So listen to the problem and give them your full attention. We've already covered a lot of that. That means phones, that means time, that means all of these different things. Remember, suicide's not the problem, only the solution to a perceived insolvable problem. Again, or a permanent solution to a temporary problem is another way of looking at it. As we, as a collective, have learned, while things and horrible situations are long and drawn out, they are, at the end of the day, temporary. So suicide is that permanent solution to it, which is not, it's a perceived solution to it that doesn't give the person the opportunity to see the other side of that temporary problem. Don't rush to judgment. Again, with this audience, I don't necessarily think I have to say that. But it is something that we all have to do our check. We all have biases. We all have our things we're bringing to the table. So just, if you grew up in an alcoholic household, it might be a little tougher for you to deal with an alcoholic who is suicidal. Know that and manage it. So offer hope in any form. Then ask, will you go with me to get help? And that's a very simple and direct. Will you go with me right now to get help? And sometimes that just means going with me to my office, and we are going to get on the phone and start finding resources, or the suicide prevention hotline, etc. Will you let me help you get help? So a lot of times we kind of, and I'm guilty of this in the helping profession. We go, all right, well, here you're, we sort of take charge. The idea of the persuade part is you want the person engaged in the process. You want the person to be empowered to say, you're helping me get help, but I'm going to be the decision maker. You'll get better results if that's the case. Will you promise me not to kill yourself until we found some help? So if you're going through order of importance, I would put this at the end. I'm not the biggest fan of this sentence. I don't professionally like engaging in promise making because I think it puts everybody in a weird position. So in the event that somebody cannot chemically or mentally follow through with whatever that promise is, there's a lot of residual fallout. So I don't necessarily know if I would use this last one. So your willingness to listen and to help can rekindle hope and make all the difference. So really the idea with this is a framework to sit down and how to have a conversation with someone about a delicate topic. And we all know when we feel listened to, particularly if we feel alone, that works. We feel validated. We feel like we're not alone in this. All right. Are there any questions before we get to refer?
There is one.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
How do you manage those prejudices?
That is incredibly, I think you could do an entire training just on that. and I am probably not going to do this 100%, this question 100% justice. I can only talk about my perspective, and how I would do it is, so I think when we have experience in the field, when we start working with people, we do come into contact with those that we don't work. So I'll give you an example. I am not very talented at working with individuals that have borderline personality disorder. And I'm not alone in that. That actually is something that I've heard pretty frequently. So oftentimes I just take a deep breath and acknowledge my shortcomings and acknowledge that I have something to learn in that scenario. I just don't know what that is. But then I also manage it by knowing I may not be the best person that day to be the person to do the intervention. And this is something that takes a while for those of us in the helping world to sort of acknowledge that I can't help everyone and I can't save everyone. And I may have to tag off. I may not be the best individual to have that person share their experience with. So to know when to leave too is a level of managing those expectations, those biases. But that being said, going at it from a perspective of we have a shared history of humanity, a shared experience. No one, I don't care what your background is, no one wants to feel alone. No one likes considering suicide as an option. So if you start there and build, it's a lot less likely that you're going to judge that person. So again, I struggle with that question. I think it's okay to struggle and acknowledge that we struggle with it. But I hope that answered some of it. So are there any other questions?
Yes, Paul, thank you for that. We have another question on the question section.
Okay.
Is it effective to say, are you thinking of harming yourself? Or is it better to use more direct language, e.g., are you thinking of killing yourself? Are you thinking of committing suicide?
So I'll answer it in two ways. One, it depends on what you want to get out of the conversation. If you feel the person's genuinely suicidal, then absolutely follow that up with, are you considering harming yourself? Are you considering killing yourself? Because you want to get to the root of that, because tied in all of this, and we could give an entire presentation about cutting and that kind of harming behavior. You either may gloss over the cutting, or you may miss the suicidality. So it depends on what you think that individual needs in that moment. But if you're going to ask the harming question, I would follow it up with, you can start that way, absolutely. And that is actually a very nice, smooth way than running into a room being like, are you going to kill yourself? Like, that's a bucket of cold water on someone. Are you thinking about harming yourself? And then if it's me personally, I'm going to say, how? Like, walk me through, what are you thinking? And it does enter in, and then and then it becomes a comfortable world to say, like, are you considering killing yourself? Like, is this something that is an option? All right. I hope I answered the question. So are there any others before we move on to refer?
Not right now, Paul.
All right. So obviously, suicidal folks often believe that they cannot be helped. So you may have to do more. And again, this goes back to when we were talking about carving out time. And we all know, I forget the exact phrase, but like sort of the client or the patient that is a high demand client or patient. So suicidal individuals tend to be real high risk if they're actively suicidal. So they're going to need extra time and extra resources. The best referral, and for anyone in case management knows this next sentence, the best referral, the next couple bullet points, I feel like you guys should tell me these, involves taking the person directly to someone who can help. Unfortunately, the way our systems are built right now, it's oftentimes we go, oh, okay, referral, got it. Hold on a moment. Please take all of these papers and go to that building on Washington Street that's 1.5 miles away. Good luck. That's not the best way to do a referral. And we all know the best in under ideal circumstances. Like, I'm not unrealistic where I'm saying like, you're going to be able to walk every client or every patient to the services they need. That's incredibly unrealistic and diminishes the sort of huge caseload that a lot of people probably on this call have. But that's the best way. If you're a nurse on the floor and you can walk that person to the social worker, awesome. The next best referral is getting a commitment from them to accept help and then making the arrangements to get that help. So for example, in my current capacity, one of the ways I would do that is have them come into my office, or that would be pre-pandemic, but have them at the hallway of the office with the plexiglass. And I say, all right, you've accepted help. I'm on the phone right now with Bain Care. Please talk to them. That's a great way to do a referral. And it puts individuals on the spot where they're like, oh, all right, I guess I'm here. I can't come up with any excuses to not do this. I guess I'll do it. And then the third best referral is to give referral information and try to get a good faith commitment to not complete or attempt suicide. Any willingness to accept help at some time, even in the future, is a good outcome. So yes, but I think we all know, again, this is like the promise making. I'm not a fan of professionally getting involved in making commitments and promise making and all of that. If you can do 1 and 2, stay with that. I would not, this is the last option on the table of like good faith commitment and now I'm going to leave you alone. If somebody's actively suicidal, and again, some of these rules may be slightly different given whatever employee handbook you have, that you may be mandated to tell X, Y, and Z individual that person in bed 4 is suicidal. So the walking away I use sort of metaphorically. But that being said, in sort of community settings, any willingness to get help is really the goal, and keeping in mind that we can't drag people to treatment. We see that in the substance use world. We see that in mental health world. We see that even sometimes in diabetes management. There's a part of it that we have to acknowledge. We can't force the person to do the thing we know is healthier for them. So getting some willingness to accept help is a good thing. So remember, since almost all efforts to persuade someone to live instead of attempt suicide will be met with some agreement and relief, don't hesitate to get involved. So don't feel like I can't talk about this or I can't have this conversation. Have it. People will tell you more than you ever realize they will. And they'll appreciate, again, being heard. So are there any questions before we go through some examples of like how to make it a little more effective when you're having the conversation?
Not right now, Paul.
Okay, all right. So for effective, things you can say that will sort of not inspire, but like give people a little glimmer of hope and the idea that you're on their side and you care is, I want you to live. That's an incredibly powerful statement to say to someone. I'm on your side, we'll get through this. And again, I keep pointing back to our current circumstances, but we've been in a year. And the idea that a collective will get through something is something that appeals to us as humans and as people. And knowing someone's on your side is life-saving, quite frankly. Get other people involved. Don't go at this alone, whether it's professionally or personally. Like, find that one coworker that you work really well with, or the one that you know has the resources. Find that sort of family member or friends, anybody. The faith community is terrific in this world if that's something that resonates with an individual. Bishop, I don't know why they put this on the slide, by the way. I don't know if you're in the Archdiocese of Boston, if you're going to enlist the aid of O'Malley. I don't think he's going to be the guy, but I mean, go with whoever you're comfortable with, but make sure other people are involved. You don't have to go at this alone, and ask the person who's somebody they connect with, who might be able to help. It may be some just random person. And I'll give you an example. There was a case of, this was my time at, I think it was Boston Medical Center, an emergency situation where this guy kept landing in the emergency room and for real minor things. And it wasn't until I stopped and asked, hey, you can go to your primary for this. Like, what's up? Turned out his sponsor, he was an AA, and his sponsor was an EMT. So the guy he trusted was his sponsor. That was the person he talked to the most. He trusted was an EMT. And when he'd talk about his symptoms, the EMT would automatically say, oh, hey, man, you need to go to the ED to deal with that issue. That's who he trusted. So that would be the person you'd want to reach out to for that for more help and more support for both you and the individual. Join a team. Again, this is more for you because as we know, as the work that we all do, this is incredibly hard work, and it's incredibly draining, and that's without a pandemic. And oftentimes we don't feel financially compensated for the job we've done, and a lot of times we don't feel emotionally compensated for the work we're doing. So joining a team where you work with clergy or you work with therapists or psychiatrists is incredibly helpful, because then you can tag team it. You can have them, sort of the psychiatrist, take care of the clinical aspect of it, or the therapist, and say, well, your role in this all is to head that way. Because again, this is a community-based gatekeeping training. So you're not going to play the role of the clinician. You're playing the role of have the conversation, get them towards the resources, pointing out that there's hope. And then this last one, I can't stress this enough, because, and I will caveat it, where it's professionally appropriate, because some of us are in that weird spot where to follow up would be kind of sketchy. So but again, back to the care for you, having this intense conversation, follow up with that individual with a visit, a phone call, card, anything that makes you comfortable, because it lets them know that you're still connected, that they had a vulnerable experience with you and you still care. They showed you a part of them that probably didn't want to talk about, and you still care, and that is life-saving. And then to sort of wrap up before other questions, hopefully, please rack your brains, ask me questions. I do better interacting with an audience and with questions, so I'm desperate. When you apply QPR, you plant the seeds of hope. Hope helps prevent suicide. Or, as I like to say, where there's life, there's hope. So I'll end this with an example of this, that we, at the beginning of the lockdown, we were going to have what we call the Hope Garden in Weymouth. And unfortunately, because no one could meet, those in the springtime, that was put on hold. So what I ended up doing was creating these bags of seeds and rocks with inspirational messages, and then people could sign up and get them delivered. And I delivered over 150 of those little hope bags where people could plant gardens in their own home, because we were all home. And the pictures I got and the way people sort of bonded over that it was amazing. So even in the most adverse circumstances and even at our saddest, if we can find that one little seed of hope, it is the thing that keeps us moving and it keeps us surviving. We've been here for thousands of years. We're gonna be here for thousands of years. And that's the message with QPR that you have to share with individuals when they're struggling. So with that, I'm gonna open it up to questions and hopefully continue some more of the conversation.
Paul, thank you
Yeah.
for the information. I'm going to give people a chance to
Absolutely.
type in their questions and maybe even comment if they've had any
Absolutely.
experiences. Somebody has actually right now typed in a question. A couple of times you've mentioned the pitfalls of entering into promises or getting commitments from a suicidal person. Is that different than contracting for safety, which was the intervention preached years ago when I was in school? Is contracting for safety no longer part of the standard of care, or has it just been reframed?
I think it depends on the facility. No, I think what I'm talking about is more of this as applied to a community environment or a casual promise. Contracting with safety is it's sort of a very formal process in the sense of it's called a contract. So like, I'm talking more about like being casual about making promises, and especially if it's in outside of a clinical environment, it not being the greatest. That's more of what I'm going at.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question. Do you ever offer to call a family member or friend to come and pick them up and engage with them during the referral?
Yes, I mean, I would let the individual guide that because unless they're a minor. So caveat all of this and say, unless they're a minor, then I'm going to find sort of the most appropriate parental figure in that person's life and get them involved immediately. So, but family or friend, yes, absolutely. I think getting family and friends involved in it is a great way. But again, letting the patient or the client, however you're framing it, or the friend guide that, because you don't want to pick the individual. And then when we were talking earlier about like find the person that they would connect with, like that, absolutely. And during the referral process, it makes it a lot less anxiety inducing for the person. So for example, say the person says, yes, absolutely, and I think I need inpatient. That's a huge step for that person. So having them being driven by a non-stranger isn't completely appropriate. But again, letting the person decide that. That way it's not you imposing your will on things.
At what point would you feel, along the lines of that question, do you ever offer to call a family member or friend to come and pick them up? What point would you feel that someone needs to be admitted or sectioned?
I would, at that point, if they are and none of my attempts at persuasion are working, would be one, or two, if it's imminent. So like, this is not a technique to use if somebody is actively in the process of attempting suicide. So you're not using this in the bridge scenario. That you call the authority. This wasn't designed for that sort of crisis, like actual acute crisis situation. This is more of somebody feeling hopeless, maybe dealing with like long-term depression, those kind of situations where it's not, where we're at contemplative but not action, if that makes sense.
Would you call 911?
In acute, in like those sort of extreme circumstances, absolutely. If they do have a therapist or a clinician, I would reach out to that individual immediately and let them make the clinical judgment. In Weymouth, we're lucky that we have a clinician who's assigned to our police community outreach officer. So she would be somebody I would get immediately involved if I'm feeling like there's any level of resistance and the person is still talking about suicide. That's when I go, all right, Paul Williams and his skills with QPR are not what this individual needs. They need a person who can fill out the paperwork and get them into treatment immediately.
Thank you. Here's another question. If someone is acknowledging they feel depressed, maybe even suicidal, but is adamant they don't want to get any help and say they won't do anything, how aggressive do you get, particularly if they are substance impaired?
If they're substance impaired, try not to have them be unsupervised. A lot of completed suicides happen when people are under the influence. It just heightens that sense of impulsive act. Be as aggressive as you are comfortable being professionally and personally aggressive. And then know that you can enlist the services of higher clinical care. I've sectioned individuals. I've called the clinician who's assigned to the police department. You can do that because people are resistant, and reasoning, doing a QPR session with somebody who's intoxicated would be incredibly difficult and frustrating for all parties involved. So that part, if it's a residential facility, then go through the protocols of what you do with a client who's in crisis. If it's out in the community, involve someone who has the ability to section them or bring them to the ED, the paramedics, EMTs, those sort of like next level of care beyond the let's sit here and have a conversation and get you hopeful. This is not a training or a framework that would work really well if someone's drunk. It wouldn't. Because what it would do is you would engage in just a struggle back and forth. And they're not going to remember a lot of what you're talking about if they're under the influence heavily enough.
I like the advice about staying with them. That's probably the safest thing you can do.
Absolutely. And also you're doing something, even if it's sitting there quietly while they rant and rave. Yeah. Like you are actively doing something. I think people forget that sometimes. I didn't do anything. No, you sat there and you kept them safe, period.
You touched briefly on people with borderline personality disorder and the challenges. Can you describe an effective way to deal with a person who makes repeated threats to kill themselves, at least in part, to manipulate the people around them? Or is that a subject so complex as to not be in the scope for this training?
If I could take moderator privilege for the first time in this training, I'm going to go with the second one, because if anyone out there has discovered, I would love to learn. Again, that is what you just hit on the head. Why I find it so incredibly difficult to work with that particular diagnostic. And I think a lot of people shared my frustration and that is, I have yet to really crack that nut, and I think that would be a lengthier training at a different point. And if you're offering it, I would love to sign up for it.
I have a question, Paul.
Sure.
What would you advise somebody who feels they need to bring their child in for an evaluation for self-harm, you know, cutting, those kinds of behaviors? They're not really trying to take their life, but they're also afraid that their child's going to be taken from them. You know, they feel like they need help pretty urgently in the moment. That's what they feel anyway, as the parent. But they're concerned that if they go to the emergency room, you know, South Shore Hospital has emergency, I don't know if it's emergency psych
Right. Mhm.
unit, which is helpful. But the fear that I've heard from parents of adolescents is that they will, their children will be taken from them and they'll end up being admitted someplace when all they really wanted was urgent help.
Right. And let's be frank, that's a genuine fear. Like that sometimes does happen. We've all seen those cases that are heartbreaking. So I would acknowledge, my advice to that individual is, one, I would acknowledge their fear. Say, you're absolutely right on some level to be afraid of this. And then, in the best way I could, really offer to them that whatever happens next isn't as important as getting your child into some manner of treatment right now. So stressing upon that it can be worked on, and using yourself as a resource that you can circle back with me if the worst case scenario happens. We'll figure out a way to move it, but acknowledging the reality of their fear, but then also stressing the importance of doing it step by step, and saying, well, if that's something that is going to happen, we need to address it then. But currently, the biggest issue on the table is the fact that your child needs to be assessed for something, because then your worst case scenario will absolutely happen when they're not assessed and law enforcement gets involved in your life, or the schools get involved in your life. So really stressing that it's often healthier and better for an individual to be proactive when dealing with these sort of pre-existing state agencies.
Thank you. It seemed to me that the questions, all of the sections on QPR are appropriate for many age groups.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them, at least from maybe middle childhood and up, maybe not those. You know. What do you have any other thoughts to offer about adapting to different age groups or even different populations besides age?
So this module, actually, this is the general overall module. There's actual trainings that the Institute has done that focus on doing QPR with children, doing QPR with older Americans. Like, the list is pretty exhaustive. That one of the modules that I've done was actually at it was a couple of years ago, and it saddens me now. They had a conference out at the Soldiers Home for returning vets. So I did a QPR training with returning vets for like sort of a peer-to-peer conversation, because veteran suicide, even though we've de-escalated worldwide, we're still deploying men and women, and suicide is still an issue in that community a lot. I come from a military family, so I'm very passionate about that particular topic, but they've done modules that focus strictly on how to talk to that individual about those particular issues. So I don't know if that answered 100% your question, but you can adapt this to be very specific.
Okay, that's helpful. I'm going to give it a minute to see if there's any other questions.
Sure. And thank you, crowd I can't see, for asking all of these questions. I appreciate it. I will say another high-risk community, even here in Massachusetts, is they have a module for Native Americans. That's a very historically and currently a high-risk community for suicide.
Yep. Well, I'd like to thank you for this wonderful presentation. I love that it is so user-friendly. You said you'd be sending us a foldable card, kind of
Yes.
sheet or a guide that we can put in our pocket. And,
Absolutely.
For those of us who don't easily commit things to memory anymore, that would be wonderful.
Absolutely.
I'd like to remind everybody to complete their evaluation. And if Doug or Maureen, you don't have anything to add, I'll give you a minute.
This is Doug. I just want to say thank you to Paul and thank you, Nancy, for organizing this. This has been a great program.
Wonderful. Thank you again, everybody. I hope you have a great evening and rest of your week and a good weekend. It's supposed to be beautiful.
Excellent.
And thank you again, Paul, so much for all you do for
Oh,
the community and for sharing that with us tonight.
you're welcome. Thank you for having me, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Good night.